Hello fellow orchid lovers, it's Danielle here with a water culture video. Going to discuss what water culture is and how I apply it to my environment. And just as a little statement in the beginning, I want everyone to know that this is the way that works for me. And I don't want anyone to say, well, Danielle said I have to do it this way, so I'm going to do it this way. I really encourage all of you to do your own research and also to pay attention to the orchids in your own environment, because your environment is going to be different than mine. And the way that you can apply water culture is going to be different than mine as well. So the first real question comes to the fore with this discussion is, what is water culture? So water culture is basically growing hydroponically. Hydroponics isn't just one thing. Hydroponics, if you look it up online, there's several different methods that people use to grow hydroponically. One method is to use an inorganic media so that the person growing the plant has full control over the nutrients that the plant is getting, and also the plant is never going to be affected by breakdown of the media. So that's one way of growing hydroponically, and one thing that it's called commonly in the orchid growing world is semi-hydro. So a lot of people are growing in semi-hydro, which is a form of hydroponics, and they can use many different things to grow semi-hydro. Majority of people use leca beads, which is L-E-C-A, and they find some great success with that. And then other people use river rock, lava rock, several different types of media that are inorganic and aren't going to break down. So that's semi-hydro, and that's a version of hydroponics. Another version of hydroponics is a bare-rooted method, which is what water culture really is. And the benefits of water culture, as opposed to growing in media, whether it be inorganic or organic media, is that you have control over how much water and how much air the orchid is exposed to. A lot of people think that water culture is just taking an orchid and throwing it in water, and that's not the case. It's finding that delicate balance between water and air. An orchid's roots need air, need oxygen as much as the leaves do. If you think about it, a lot of orchids, when they grow in nature, they grow on trees, on twigs, on all different types of things, but their roots are primarily exposed to the air. So you have to remember when you're growing an orchid that the roots need air. And the great thing about growing in water culture is you have direct control over how much air and how much water the plant is getting at any given time. So that's something that you keep in mind about water culture. You don't want to suffocate your roots in water. You want to make sure that the levels of water, for whatever method that you choose, are appropriate for the orchid to both be getting the nutrient needs from the water, but also that the roots aren't covered completely in water and that the base of the plant is not getting too wet. Because both of those things is going to lead to root rot, which we'll discuss root rot towards the end of this video. So there are two types of water culture. You have full water culture and you have semi-water culture. So full water culture just basically implies that the orchid roots are in contact with water in some form all week. So the whole week they're in water. At least a portion of the roots is in water. And semi-water culture traditionally is an orchid that is kept in water for 2 days and then is allowed to dry for 5. And again, when I say water, that's water, but only a portion of the roots, not the entire root system of the orchid. And semi-water culture can be tweaked. Just because most people use, the 2-day/5-day method doesn't mean that if you have a particularly dry environment, you can't give them an additional day, or in the middle of that 5-day dry, give them some water. So the semi-water culture method is great because it can be tweaked to each individual orchid and to your environment. So there's two different types of orchid root. We have our really fine roots, like you see here on my Shari Baby, very fine roots. And then we also have chunky root. So fine-rooted orchids, you're going to find typically need to be in contact with water most of the time. There are people that do allow their fine-rooted orchids to approach dryness at least once a week. Olivia posted a video yesterday, she also about water culture, and she mentions that she does do that for her Oncidium type orchids, her fine-rooted orchids. And then there's some that you do need to let them dry out. And even though it's a fine-rooted orchid, you would think, okay, it needs water all the time. Like, for instance, a Tolumnia, they have little teeny tiny roots, but traditionally they are supposed to dry out. So there are exceptions to the fine-rooted rule. In addition, there are some caution that you want to use as far as if you're going to let your Oncidium type dry out. For instance, I have a Miltonia here. Miltonias are extremely fussy plants. My Miltonia doesn't have a spectacular root system. It came with very poor roots. It's now finally starting, let me see if I can take it out and show you. It's now finally starting to grow some new roots, which is great. I'm very excited about that. But I don't want this orchid to get dehydrated, and so I try to be careful and not let the roots dry out at any time. Until it has a significant root system where it's getting hydrated appropriately. I mean, I don't freak out if I see that the roots are starting to dry and drop what I'm doing and run and get my water and water them. But I do try to maintain some moisture in the glass at all times. Other Oncidium types you might find in your environment, you can let the roots approach dryness and they're fine. Personally, for myself, I do keep, or I try to keep my fine-rooted orchids in water at all times. So one of the main ways that I grow my Oncidium or my fine-rooted types is I have glass beads in the bottom of whatever vessel I have them in, and that helps to elevate the rhizome so that it's not going to be sitting in the water, it's not going to get too damp, and I let the roots kind of go down into the glass beads. Once this orchid establishes a good root system that I don't need the glass beads, I will take the glass beads away. But most of my Oncidiums are in a quote-unquote recovery period. So most of my Oncidiums, if not all I think, are in glasses with glass beads. And it does seem to be working. As you can see, there's amazing growth, amazing new roots on this orchid. So that's the fine-rooted orchids. Then you have orchids with more chunky roots. Sorry guys if you get dizzy. Which is going to be your Cattleyas, your Phalaenopsis, your Bandaceous types. They all have the more chunky roots. And with chunky roots, you'll find that those types of orchids can in fact dry out for some length of time, and they should be fine. For instance, Cattleyas, it's well known that they do like to dry out before they get moisture again. So semi-water culture would be the way that you would go with a Cattleya. Phalaenopsis, they're pretty flexible. They can do both. Some people do semi-water culture with their Phalaenopsis and they have great results. Personally, I don't. I do full water culture with my phals, but each Phalaenopsis is tweaked differently. I don't just put the same level of water in with every orchid, and I'm going to show you what I mean. So for instance, this phal, you're going to see the water level is pretty low. And that's consistently how low I keep the water level, and that's because the main root has a break in it. And so I always keep the water level. Sorry how blurry this is. It's such a really grim day out. So the lighting is not good. Here you go. So there's a break in the root, so I don't put that break down into the water for this particular orchid. I have other orchids that have breaks in their roots and they've calloused over them and the break is fine in the water, but this particular orchid, that's not the case. Now she is developing more roots, so there might be a day when that one root is not as important, but until that point, I do not put the water above that break in the root, and she's perfectly fine. She's nice and healthy. She did only have one root at one time, so her newer leaves are smaller because she did go through some stress. But she is firm and hydrated. She's getting new roots everywhere. Whereas you have an orchid like this, there's another Phalaenopsis, quite a bit more water. And this one can go both ways. This particular Phalaenopsis is one of my Phalaenopsis that I can take out of water and let the roots completely dry and she's fine. Not all of my Phalaenopsis I can do that, but she is one that will handle that. And I think one of the main reasons why that's the case in my environment is I have a very dry house. I have forced hot air heat, and so if I dry out the roots, it's not just the roots that are dry, the air around is dry, and so I try not to let my Phalaenopsis dry out. If they go 24 hours dry, it more than likely is not going to kill them, but I do try to keep them in full water culture. But again, that might not be something that works in your environment. You might find that your orchid is staying too wet, and you may find that you do need to drain off the water and let the roots just kind of take a little break from the water, and that's fine. And that's what works for your environment, so that's good. Then I have other Phalaenopsis over here. This Phalaenopsis I've had for quite a while, and I don't really put the water that high because she doesn't seem to need the water that high. She seems to like it round about there. My newer Phalaenopsis, they're having some trouble with some root rot, which is typical, you know, for orchids. The thing about water culture, which I've mentioned before, is that you can't hide rotting roots or, you know, poor roots in water culture. If you put a root in water and it's not a healthy root, it is going to start to rot. And that's not bad. You know, a lot of people use the fact that roots rot in water as the reason why water culture is not a good method to use. But really, if you think about it, if the root is unhealthy, you unpot the orchid, it seems fine. You put it back in bark, or you put it back in moss, or you put it back in semi-hydro, or whatever it is that you put it in. The root's still unhealthy. Whatever you put it in, it's going to die. Same thing with water culture. You put an unhealthy root in water, just like if you put an unhealthy root in bark or any other type of media, it's still going to die. The only thing with the water is just going to kind of speed that process up a little bit. So usually with new orchids, I don't offer that much water. I don't put a higher level. Like this orchid I've had for about, I would say 9 to 10 months. So I can put a higher level of water because I now know those roots. I'm familiar with those roots. I know what they can take. Whereas my new orchids, I don't put the level that high, and I'm constantly checking the roots and removing velamen if it's rotting. And that's just not that the root is going to stop dying. If a root's going to die, it's going to die. But it just slows down the process a little bit and gives the orchid a chance to recover. So if the root's starting to die, it just kind of signals the orchid to put out more roots. But that doesn't just happen overnight. It is something that you have to allow time for. So by putting less water in the glass, I'm slowing the rotting process down and allowing the orchid to have more time to push out new roots so that we won't have a rescue mission on our hands. So here's another example of semi-water culture. This is a Cattleya. And honestly, with my Cattleyas, I do have glass beads in a lot of their vases. And if I go around, you know, a couple of days after I put the water in, and there's still water in the beads, but it's not really touching the roots, I don't dump it. It's not touching the roots, it's providing humidity into the glass, so I just leave it alone, and they seem to appreciate that. This is my mini phal. It's also in full water culture, and as you can see, it's pretty happy. And then there's the Vandaceous types. This is a Rhynchostylus, and it's in full water culture. The tips of the roots are always in water, all the time. And she has spiked for me, and she has another spike coming. She has a leaf right there. I did find, I started to put my actual Vanda, my Sensei Blue, in full water culture, and she doesn't like that, but she doesn't like anything that I've done to her, so I still haven't really found what she likes, and I've had that orchid for about 10 months now. So, you know, that's another thing you have to keep in mind when it comes to water culture, is that each orchid is different. You can't just say, I have a Phalaenopsis, so I'm going to put you in full water culture. You may have a Phalaenopsis that doesn't enjoy full water culture, and you may need to give it that dry out time. Or you may have a Cattleya who is a thirsty girl. She has a really amazing root system, and she needs more than 2 days of water. You know, you have to pay attention to your plants. So whenever you get a new plant, you know, based on the type of root system and the type of care instructions that you've been able to find for the orchid, if you're going to do water culture, put it in that method, but don't just ignore your plants. Take a look at how they're doing after a couple of days. And if you need to tweak your method, tweak it. I'm constantly tweaking my method. There's no time that I'm not changing vases, you know, taking a look at things and saying, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that. And, you know, so far so good. I've had some really, really amazing results. And I wouldn't say that I'm an expert at water culture, not by any means, but, you know, I really do pay attention to each individual plant. I don't just say, okay, water culture means this for you, and then just leave it alone. I do tweak my method. I do tweak what I'm doing with each individual orchid. So that's something you want to keep in mind. And then you also want to keep in mind your particular environment and what season you have. So, for instance, in the winter, your orchids aren't going to be as thirsty, traditionally. I mean, if you have a house that you keep at 80 degrees, or you live in a very warm environment, you may find that they do stay thirsty all year round. But if you live in a cold environment like mine, you're going to see the growths are going to slow down, the root production is going to slow down, they're not going to be drinking water as quickly. In the summer, I find that I can't hardly keep up with watering my orchids. Like, for instance, I just watered this orchid, so this level of water is exactly where I would traditionally keep it. In the summer, within 24 hours, that scared me. That was my dog. She was stretching and she hit the door. Within 24 hours, that level is going to be a lot lower. And I'll have to go back and top it up. So, you know, you have to keep in mind, where do you live? And that's going to tell you how you're going to apply water levels and, you know, how many days you're going to expose them to water. The other thing is going to be the season. Like I said, if it's a colder season, you live in a colder environment, your orchid's going to slow down and it's not going to need as much water. So if you just say, every Wednesday, I fill up the glass, regardless of whether the orchid has drank the water or not, you know, you are going to run into some rotting problems because you're giving the orchid too much water. So it's really paying attention to your plants. And again, water culture is not for everyone. If you've been growing in bark for years and you love it, then why would you change? If, you know, I don't see the need for you to change. I mean, if you want to experiment, there's nothing wrong with that, but water culture is not particularly something that you're just gonna excel at automatically. It is a stiff learning curve. I have never killed any orchids because of water culture. I've had orchids that I've gotten that were sick, and so I could, you know, by the time I realized they had the dreaded F, they were dead. Other orchids, I applied water culture inappropriately, and it was a learning curve for me, and now I know better. But I did, you know, lose a few orchids because I didn't really know what I was doing at first. And that brings me to root rot. Now, there are a lot of people that are against water culture. Quite a few people feel that it's unnatural, and why would you do that to your plants, and it forces them to dump their roots and grow water roots, and that's not true. Root rot is going to happen whether you grow in bark, whether you grow in moss, whether you grow in semi-hydro, whatever you grow in. Orchids shed their roots. They do. They also shed leaves. They shed pseudobulbs. It's a constant cycle for them. And when it's no longer helping the plant hydrate itself or photosynthesize or whatever the case may be, it gets rid of it. So there is going to be some root rot. I find that when you buy orchids, they are usually in a pretty sorry state. Orchid nurseries are not all the same. Some take a lot of pride in what they do, and you do get some really great orchids from them, but it is a business. And so in order for them to make money on orchids, they do kind of have to mass produce these plants sometimes. And sometimes the care goes by the wayside a little bit. And so for the most part, I find that it's very rare for me to get an orchid that does not have very poor roots. Every once in a while, I'll get an orchid and it's got amazing roots, and I'll be shocked and extremely thrilled, but that is very rare. I find that most orchids that I get, the root system is poor, and so you are going to find that the roots are going to rot. And like I said, even if you're repotting in a media, whatever media it is, whether it's inorganic or organic, there is going to be some root loss. Same thing with water culture. There is going to be root rot. It's just how it is. And you need to expect it and anticipate it and not freak out about it. Orchids can recover from root rot. I have several orchids in my collection that lost every single one of its roots, and it's still alive, and one of them is actually putting out a spike now. So, if you are of the faint heart variety and an orchid losing its roots is going to scare you and put you into panic mode, then water culture may not be the best thing for you. Now, do all of the orchids shed their roots when they get put into water culture? No. This phal back here that I was just showing you the blooms on, never had a problem with her roots. There were a few roots that when I got her were rotting already, and I took the velamin off, but she crossed over to water culture without even batting an eye. So you're going to have some that are just going to be fine, and then you're going to have some that you're going to get that already have really poor root systems, and they are going to shed their roots. But that's whatever method you grow in. It doesn't matter whether it's water or it's media, you're going to have root rot. It's just the nature of the beast. It's just how plants grow. And so just be prepared for that. And again, you don't have to grow in water culture. All these people that have opinions about water culture and say some pretty nasty things, I could tell you some, but I'm not gonna. So don't grow in water culture. If you don't like it, don't use it. I don't bash people for growing in traditional methods. I think that, if I could, I would, but it doesn't work for me. So I don't grow in traditional methods. I use water culture. I would never bash someone for, the method that they choose to use. It's just childish and stupid. But anyways, that's basically, how I apply water culture in my environment. I can't emphasize enough to you, though, just because it's the way I do it doesn't mean it's the way you should do it. Just because I do water culture doesn't mean you should do water culture. And just because I use full water culture on some and semi-water culture on others doesn't mean that you need to follow what I'm telling you to do on your orchids. I'm just telling you what I find works in my environment and what water culture means. Make sure that you're giving your orchids, moisture, but also make sure that you're giving them oxygen. The roots need oxygen just as much as the rest of the plant does. So be careful when you're applying water culture to your roots. And, do your research. Don't just say, I'm going to try this and not really know what you're doing. I kind of did that when I first started. And I guess it's because there really wasn't a whole lot that I found. And that's one of the reasons why I started my channel, is because there were a few, resources out there, but not that much. And so, try to do your research and pay attention. If you're going to take one of your orchids and put it in water culture just as an experiment, watch that orchid. And find out about water culture before you just do it. Don't just say, oh, well, I know people are growing orchids in water, so I'm just going to plop this thing in water and see what happens. Figure out what type of orchid you have, what the needs of that orchid is, and then apply water culture and watch your plant. Can't emphasize that enough. Watch your plant. It's going to tell you if it's happy or not, and if it's not happy, you need to tweak your method. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I hope that was comprehensive and understandable. I did try. I really did try. I tried recording this already once today, and I hated it. So this is my second attempt. Because I really want, instead of just rambling in my thoughts and confusing people, to give people some good information about water culture and what it means. And, I might even just break it down by the type of orchid and do a series of videos, Oncidiums, Cattleyas, Phalaenopsis, if that's something that you guys think that you'd be interested in. So just let me know. But I hope you all are having a good beginning to your week. And I will talk to you next time.